You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I have an author interview. I'm really excited because I'm talking to Carrie Rickey, the author of a new book, A Complicated Passion, The Life and Work of Agnes Varda. Thank you so much for coming on to join me. The book, I thought, is really interesting. And listeners, I would say, check the show notes. I'm going to put links in the show notes where you can pick up the book and find out more. But before we get into Varda, I do want to say a plug for A Complicated Passion, The Life and Work of Agnes Varda. I really enjoyed the read. The thing I found was nice about it is it has that narrative feel. It's not as dry as some of the biographies I've read. So thank you for that. As a reader, I really enjoyed it.
Yes, I added water.
But I guess to get into Varda, what drew you to her as a subject? I mean, you as a longtime film critic, you were at, like you said, the Village Voice, the Philadelphia Inquirer for decades. You've obviously encountered a lot of history, a lot of artists, a lot of filmmakers and artists of other media. Why was Varda the standout for you?
Well, I was 18 when I learned that there was such a thing as a female filmmaker. This was in a freshman college class where I saw an Agnes Varda film called Cleo from 5 to 7. And it was the first time I was aware that women were directors too. And, I was really upset that I hadn't known this. Why hadn't I heard of them? Why hadn't I seen their movies? And then I found out shortly after that in the 19 teens, there were almost as many female filmmakers as male. And then again, why hadn't I heard of them? They were making these really interesting movies about abortion, about marriage, about women in the workplace. And then I found out that all these women, or many of these women, were just erased from film history. And I wanted to correct the record. And then as a reviewer, I had reviewed or written about many Varda films, all of which were unlike anything I'd ever seen. And as a film historian, I wrote a couple of times about the history of female filmmakers. And Varda figured prominently in these. And then an agent at the beginning of COVID, an agent approached me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in writing an English language biography of Varda?" And I thought for about 30 seconds, and I thought, I could tell the history of women directors and the obstacles they faced. And because Varda had the longest career of any female filmmaker, it was 65 years. I thought that she was the perfect opportunity to speak about female directors and the obstacles they faced and not be erased. And it's important to understand that Varda wasn't only a filmmaker. She began as a still photographer. She dealt with still images. Then she moved into movies, pictures that moved. And then in the final act of her career, she made artist installations. So she went from still to moving to 3 dimensions over the course of her career. So
there's a lot there.
Yeah. And she didn't die until she was almost 91. And she worked from 19 years old to almost 91, like a dervish.
And there's so many strains that I'm picking up on there that I are front of mind for me. As you talked about the idea that Varda was a revelation to you that women could be filmmakers too. I've been to art school myself and seen the population there is, often like 60% female. And then you look at who's getting the stuff in the major museums and the galleries, and whose names do we hear in the Western canon. I mean, it's not exclusively male, but it feels disproportionate. And I try to recognize different voices, and I appreciate that. That's why I was excited about this, among other reasons. I'm also just excited to learn more about a medium that I am admittedly ignorant about. Like I've seen films, but I've not really
Thought about them.
I've not thought about them very critically. You know what I'm saying? It's not my area of expertise, but I appreciate those who do it well. Now, you talked about Varda as starting off as a still photographer and then getting into making film and then installation. And to me, I always find it interesting, the evolution of an artist. And if we can go way back to those early days, can we start off with just like a little bit about how did she get into photography and then film, sort of like who were her influences? Because she was very influential on a lot of other people with the French New Wave stuff. I'm not going to try to pronounce any of these names. That first film,
You can call it the short tip. It is called La Pointe Courte, and my French pronunciation is, as I understand it, impenetrable. So
it's better than mine. But I've seen her name as this influence on the film genre of, for blending these styles that are somewhat fictive and somewhat documentary almost, and like, doing experimental stuff. But how did she get there? Can you give us the origin story?
well, I think Varda was a self-creation. She was extremely well read. She spoke 5 or 6 languages fluently. She could pun in all of them. And she just absorbed the culture. She had a very keen eye, and she was born in Brussels, Belgium. Her father was of Greek ethnicity, but born in Turkey. And he became a French citizen by fighting for France during World War I. Her mother was the daughter of a French Protestant pastor, and the father was an engineer. The mother was what we now call a homemaker, but she was very, very interested in art, and she showed her when they lived in Brussels, which is not far from Ghent. She'd drive her kids to see the altarpiece, the Van Eyck altarpiece in Ghent. And I think it was Varda's first experience with, a visual narrative. And they went to Ghent a lot to see that masterpiece. And I think maybe her mother instilled in her a very an appreciation of visual storytelling. But I would say that might have been her major influence. She was born in 1928. When the month she turned 12, Germany started bombing the Low Countries. The family fled Belgium when the Germans started bombing the Low Countries, and the Vardas drove out of Belgium like a bat out of hell. They found a place to live in the Southwest, a town called Set, but it was very hard for a family with 5 children. to find housing, so they lived on a houseboat. It's actually a luxury sailboat, and for 3 years of the war, they lived there. And Varda befriended, or was basically adopted by her spiritual family, called the Schlegel family, where the parents and the three daughters in the Schlegel family were all artisans of various sorts. And that's what Varda wanted to be. The rest of her family was very straight-laced, and her mother and her were really interested in art. And it's as though Varda was the bohemian among these middle-class people who were not bohemian, but Varda was a born rebel and born bohemian. And they would move to Paris. And many members of the Schlegel family moved to Paris shortly after her. But when she passed her baccalaureate, which is like graduating high school or completing your SATs, but probably much more challenging, her mother bought her a camera. It was a used Rolleiflex that was bought from the publisher of a true crime magazine. And so Varda had this instrument that she explored with. And she always speaks of herself as a very shy person. But when she was a shy person with a camera in front of her, she became very loquacious. And she liked to interview people. She was social, and she liked meeting people, and she was shy. That can happen.
Yeah, there's something about having a camera there that can give you a permission structure, I think, to come out of that shell, right? Like, I would not have the confidence to approach you if I saw you at a social event, but here I've got the microphone in front of me, and it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable talking to somebody who is more accomplished and knowledgeable than I am. I think I've read that about a lot of people, where like you give them the camera and all of a sudden they can open up.
They can see. My elder daughter is a professional photographer, and her transformation into a very loquacious person happened when she had a camera in front of her. And so I've seen this happen. But Varda, when she turned 18, she ran away from her parents without telling them, and she went to Corsica and found work, her first paid work, as a woman who rowed fishermen to their fishing spots and mended fish nets and rowed the fishermen back at night, and they all lived communally and ate communally. And Varda says in her memoir, this was her initiation into the world of men. And she didn't elaborate on that. When she returned to Paris, she went to the School of the Louvre, where she studied painting and anthropology and archaeology and art history. And she aspired to be a curator, but after 3 years, she lost interest and dropped out. And then for a year, she went to the Sorbonne, where her favorite professor was the philosopher Gaston Bachelard, who spoke of the material in people and and everyday utensils. And he spoke about the poetics of space. And she started thinking about what people and places are made up of. She started thinking philosophically.
It feels like a very kind of you have that conversation at museums and at colleges about just the deep philosophy behind the soul of an object and what is embedded within there and how we're all connected. And well, It feels very esoteric and
But it wasn't for her, because it was those classes that really made her pick up the Rolleiflex that her mother had given her and think that she could, like this family, the Schlegels, who she lived near in Set, she could be an artisan like them. But the thing about the camera in France is that to ply a trade in like photography or framing, you need to be licensed. So this Louvre school dropout and Sorbonne only for a year. She did a 2-year program in 1 year at the National School of Photography and Cinematography. She got licensed. She started making money, as most photographers do, taking pictures of family rituals, kids on Santa's lap. She became very fluent with the camera, and she just knew how much light she needed. She didn't, she could basically toss away her light meter after a little while. She really understood the physics and light of the camera. She was very good at capturing people and getting people to pose by talking to them. And I mean, her Santa jobs at department stores, she would, photograph, 300 kids in a day, in an 8-hour day. And it was an assembly line, but she got great photographs because she knew how to get the good out of people.
And just for our listeners who might, like contemporary listeners, to realize the time period we're talking about, you had to really know your science when it came to photography, because
There was no autofocus.
she was working on film. And so like there wasn't a live instant preview of what this shot looked like. And you need to retake it the way that we are doing today, where I just keep tapping away and hope that one of these will work. She had to be very deliberate because we're talking at this point, we're talking the time period, it would be about 75 years ago, right?
We're talking about, yeah, exactly. 74, 75 years ago. She understood how to take photographs. And one of her friends, one of the Schlegel sisters, Andre Schlegel, had married the head of a man named Jean Villard, who is the head of the French National Theater. And Varda asked him, "Hey, can I take photographs for you? Can I take photographs of the actors?" And so she did, on a trial basis, and then he hired her. And at the same time, she was getting to know artist photographers like Versailles, who she made a little, who collaborated with her on a little slapstick film that was made by French television in, I think, 1954. And she befriended Alexander Calder, the American sculptor. And she always had the idea, when she was doing images for the theater, like, how can I tell the story of the play with posed actors? How can I frame this so you get the drama in one image? And then when she took photographs of people like Calder, who was then making his mobiles, she sent Calder out into the middle of the street they both lived on, Rue de Guerre, and she said, "Dance with your mobile." And so he was dancing with he was moving and the sculpture was moving. And she would photograph Versailles and other artists with their art. So it was like a dance between the art and the artist and the art. So she was very inventive, and she soon developed this reputation as, a hip photographer. And she started working for the, magazines and newspapers as well. And she was getting quite a reputation. And then one day she decided that still photography was too still, and she started working on a storyboard for a moving picture. Not that she had seen many moving pictures. She'd seen maybe 10 or 12 movies before she tried to make one. But it happened that another Schlegel sister was married to a man named Pierre who had brain cancer. And she said, maybe we can go back to this town we all grew up in, Set, and we could distract him from his diagnosis, and we could make a movie about him and his wife, and also make a movie about Set. And this was her first movie, and it was very unusual. It was called La Pointe Courte, or the Short Point, and it was where the fishermen in Set lived. And she made this story where the story of this couple who was basically in trouble and on the verge of divorce was overlaid on the story, on a larger story of the community of fishermen who were also in trouble because the health department said they were fishing in polluted waters and they couldn't ply their trade. And it was a beautifully composed, very unusual narrative where the close-ups were on this couple who was having trouble, and the wider shots were about this community that was in trouble. And somehow both the marriage issues and the community issues get resolved. And it's very beautifully told and visually told, not with a lot of dialogue. And it's like an intellectual travelogue and an intellectual view of a marriage. And it was considered the first film of the French New Wave, which was a kind of experimental movie that rebelled against what the French called the cinema of the father, the very establishment film, which was often a adaptation of a great French novel or play, shot inside a studio and cost a lot of money with very famous movie stars or stage actors.
Yeah, and so then with the French New Wave, my understanding, like the thing I've always heard about Varda is that she kind of ushered in that era of the filmmaker as almost like the author of the piece because there's such a unique lens on it.
Exactly.
Oh, the puns are just coming today. Sorry. We will come back after a short break and talk a little bit more about her work and her influence on the French New Wave and the rest of history. Before I do the cut to ads, I want to tell you about another great podcast for history lovers. It's called Calm History. If you want to learn about fascinating moments in history in the most relaxing way possible, try Calm History. Each episode is narrated in a calm voice to help you relax or even fall asleep. You'll learn about famous explorers, leaders, inventions, civilizations, and ancient wonders. Just search for Calm History on your favorite podcast player or tap the link in the show notes. Now we're back, and my guest this week, once again, I've got Carrie Rickey, the author of Complicated Passion, The Life and Work of Agnes Varda. And again, I really appreciate you coming in to take the time and explain all about this work to me, because you are a film expert and I clearly am not. So thank you again. We left off talking a little bit about Varda's work. You explained about her first film. Can you talk more about whether it's that one or another one, just a favorite piece and why it's emblematic of her work and her influence on others?
It might be weird, but we're going to time travel a little bit. Like they say in the movies, we're going to cut from 1955, when Varda makes her first film, La Pointe Courte, and we're going to jump to 1999. In the interim period, she has made travelogues, very well received feature films in France that travel the world, and are make her certainly a household name in France and among the international film community.
Also, just the fact that she was working at that point for 45 years professionally, and she went for another 20. I mean, that's mind-boggling.
Well,
That is an amazing
she
career.
was indefatigable and unstoppable and all the words like that. But in the interim, she has two children, one out of wedlock, and a second child when she marries the filmmaker Jacques Demy, who most famous for The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. And it's 1999, and Jacques Demy has died in 1990, and her kids are now grown. And she's feeling, I'm 71 years old. It's really expensive to make films. And everyone was inviting her to come to her retrospectives, but she was really worried that she'd never make a movie again, and that she was yesterday's news. And she and her kids are going to a retrospective of hers in Japan. They're at the Tokyo airport. They're in a camera store, and her son hands her a digital camera, and he says, Mom, it doesn't have to be expensive. You could use a digital camera. And he puts it into her hands, and she lifts it up, and it's under 2 pounds. It's even lighter than her view camera was, the camera she starts out with. And she thinks, hey, I can shoot with digital. I'm not a purist. Let Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese talk about how much better film is than digital. And it is, quite frankly, objectively, film has more color and range and resolution. But she wasn't a purist. She could adapt. And she decides to make a documentary called The Gleaners and I. She was in her neighborhood at the local farmers market one day when she saw modern gleaners. And, gleaners historically are the peasants who come in after the harvest and harvest the after harvest, the things that didn't get harvested. And under French law, that was allowed. In the Bible, it's also spoken of as a very important thing, to share the wealth.
Yeah, it's a way that those
without
those less fortunate can get something so they can sustain themselves. And I think that's a topic, like I feel like Van Gogh painted gleaners, and
exactly, and Millet, and she might have been thinking of Van Gogh and his potato eaters while she was putting together this movie in her mind. And she decided not to write a script. She had made documentaries before that weren't scripted, but in some senses, she felt she was as of the age and experience that she didn't have to plan out a movie beforehand. She could research the movie. And in the way that Michelangelo used to find the shape in a stone, he said you could always find a shape in a stone. She found a shape of a story in the footage. And she just went out with her lightweight camera and shot people who gleaned all around France. And she spoke with people who owned estate wineries, where some people, they allowed the peasants to come and glean the grapes after the harvest. And she also talked to people at places where gleaning was not allowed, even though it was allowed by French law. And she introduces us to such an array of people. And she talks to the local peasants who had historically harvested the leftovers of bruised fruit and not quite ripe vegetables. And The Gleaners and I would redefine Varda's career. It would earn her a new generation of fans. And frankly, it's this outward looking essay film. And unlike documentarians such as Michael Moore, she doesn't have a monologue about what people should do. She interviews people, and it's a dialogue, and it doesn't tell us what to think or what to do. It says, what do we do with this problem of waste? How do we redistribute it? How can I talk to you about how much I love going to swap meets and filing, riffling through, the trash on the street for treasures I might find. I'm a gleaner too, and I like gleaning. And, although I have money and can feed myself, and this movie combines all of her skills, her talent at portraiture, her love of landscape, her journalistic skills, her empathy as an interviewer. And it's wonderful how these people, she immediately makes friends. And believe me, Varda had a social network before there were social networks. Varda had social networks that couldn't be believed. Among her friends, for instance, were the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, the rock star Jim Morrison, who was a failed film student and just admired Varda's movies so much. She took the first screen test of Harrison Ford. She was friends with every major actor and director around the world, pretty much. Everyone wanted to work with her. But this is a movie that gave her a new social network of the underfed and unhoused. And it really touched people. She actually made a sequel to this, the Gleaners and I, which was very successful around the world. And I can't tell you how interesting it is, because she literally finds the gems among the trash in the field, in the abandoned fields, and in the appliances, the non-working appliances people find on the street. And she finds the people who are distributing the leftover potatoes and tomatoes and grapes to people who need them. And she finds the mostly men who are fixing the broken refrigerators and stoves left on the street and repurposed for people who can't afford to buy them themselves. And Varda movies very often presaged a new zeitgeist. And she reached out to a new audience with this film, with new technology. She was adapting to new technology. She was talking to the people who usually weren't in films and making them really interesting characters. And even in their poverty, they were learning how to do things for communities, to elevate these communities and feed these communities. And she spurred a new generation of eco-conscious millennials. And very unusually, as Varda grew older, her audience grew wider. And that's the moral of this story. And she continued to work 20 more years till she was almost 91. And she has the longest career of any female filmmaker.
Now, I'm curious because one thing you said there, well, I mean, there are a lot of things you said there, but one of the most recent things you said in there that I picked up on that I wanted to draw out just a little further was about how her work seems to be a forerunner to other trends that are going to come. And I'm curious, do you think that's because of her social network of other filmmakers and stuff that looked up to her and see what she's doing and try to replicate it? Do you think it's because she was so social and made connections with others beyond just the tastemakers, but also the gleaners? She had her finger on the pulse for what just is in the ether that people are ready for, that like she's picking up on, the impression that I get is she's one of those people who goes through the world like a sponge and just soaks in so much from so many disparate sources that she's putting out something that other people weren't conceiving of, and she's making these connections that are unexpected. Where do you think that sort of prescience is coming from?
She made movies about the people in her neighborhood, in a movie world where only beautiful people were usually on the screen. I don't know, she's a little bit like Balzac. She wants to talk of whole communities. She wants to talk about the rich, the poor, the villains, the heroes. With her first movie, she's talking about a large community of working people and a community of two, a husband and wife who are having trouble. She makes movies about small communities and doing this in the whole world. She was representing people who are underrepresented or never represented, and she wasn't condescending to them. And that was very novel. She wasn't the well-heeled person who is giving money to help the poor. She was extolling about how the have-nots were learning new distribution systems so everyone could have something. Until the American independent movement of the 1990s and turn of the millennium, not a lot of Americans were doing this kind of work. And she really influenced a lot of American independence.
Yeah, and what seems interesting there is in some ways I feel like Varda's somebody who had a really well thought out and very personal viewpoint in her filmmaking style and her approach. And at the same time, it feels like she's open to giving others voice in her film, as you describe the gleaners and everything like that. You know what I'm saying?
She doesn't come to a situation with a preordained script. She's not filming something. She's not filming a thesis she wants to prove. She wants to talk to people and then have a thesis about it. And the people she's shooting help her find that thesis. Everyone's opinion and idea is important to her. And it's not all about her. It's not all about her and her view. It's incorporating other people's views. And it's one of the last movies she made was Faces Places with the photo muralist JR, and they collaborated together to tell stories of people in the small villages and what they were doing to keep the unions going, to make workers get fair pay. And they were going all over France and every corner and pocket to tell stories like this, the untold stories. And she just, at a certain point in her career, she started her career to tell the untold stories that focused on women. And then as she got older, she started focusing on the untold stories of all kinds of people. And I think she didn't have a plan for her life, but she adapted. She saw which way the wind was blowing, and she adapted, and she kept her eyes and ears open. And quite frankly, she had a wonderful eye, and she had very artistic cutting, and she was very entertaining as a narrator. And she was one of the few filmmakers to find that sweet spot between an edifying movie and an entertaining movie. That's gold to an audience, to learn about things but not be condescended to or lectured to.
Yeah, and I think that's where I kind of want to wrap this up with thinking about those different ways that we can look at a film. I'm not going to do the standard, Louvre or the lab or the Lou thing that I always do because, she literally studied at the Louvre and everything.
But I think her work would be welcome at any of those places.
But I do think there is something about her work that crosses some different boundaries, and I'm curious how you look at it and how you evaluate and appreciate, like if my audience is getting to know Varda, should we be looking to be entertained by a piece? Is it to inform us about other people and their struggles and important issues the way we watch a documentary? Is this to gain some insight into history? Because there is this, sort of there's a reality and authenticity, and it captures a moment in time. Like how do you view and how would you frame these pieces for an audience to appreciate the work?
Well, if you wanted to learn more about Varda, I would suggest
Buying the book, A
no,
Complicated
no, 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 no,
Passion,
no,
the
no, no,
life
no,
and
no,
work
no,
of
no,
it.
no, no. I think,
No, I know. You're not going to plug your stuff. I'm here to do that.
but I would see 3 of her movies. The first one I would suggest is Cleo from 5 to 7, which is about a very beautiful woman accustomed to being looked at and admired, who is a pop star. Her doctor tells her she might have breast cancer. The movie is shot over between the hours of 5 and 6:30, as she's kind of wondering what to do until she receives her biopsy results. And over the course of this movie, she goes from being this woman who's accustomed to being looked at, accustomed to being beautiful, terrified that her body might, she might have to have a mastectomy and her looks and figure will be lost. And she goes from this incredibly narcissistic, inner-looking woman to this woman who, oddly enough, gathers strength and confidence to go out and, instead of being looked at, do the looking herself and looking at the world around her. And it turns from this world of fright to kind of inner peace as she kind of reaches out and understands other people who are facing not parallel situations, but she meets a French soldier fighting in the Algerian War, and he's afraid of death too. And they reach out to each other, and it's truly comforting. And she understands that other people are going through this too. And it's this amazing arc from narcissism to community. Then in the 80s, she made a movie called Vagabond about a phenomenon in France that was called the New Poor, the drifters who did not want typical jobs, who just wanted to do whatever they wanted to do and drink and, camp out and, didn't want to be tied down. And she focused on a female drifter and the problems of this kind of lifestyle. And it's another fascinating movie where people all comment on this woman who to some men seems like a slut, and to some women embodies true liberation, true women's liberation. It's really interesting. She's always in her fiction movies has all these documentary elements and this chorus of people having different opinions. She's a filmmaker without judgment. And the third movie you should see is Gleaners. That will give you, the breadth of Varda's career. And reading the book wouldn't hurt.
Well, I do want to say once again, I really appreciate your taking the time. My guest today, again, film critic Carrie Rickey, and the book is A Complicated Passion, The Life and Work of Agnes Varda. Cannot recommend it strongly enough. It was a pleasant read, which, like, for me, for a biography nonfiction, I'm going to be honest, a lot of times nonfiction is a little bit of a slog for me. It's usually kind of dry, but this book was a page turner, cannot put it down. And listeners, links are in the show notes. Thank you once again, Carrie Rickey.
Thank you, Kyle.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.